Good evening and welcome to this, the first edition of Perigo. I'm Lindsay Perigo and I'm dangerous. Perigo, you see, is Portuguese for danger, and I intend to live up to that. Dangerous to whom, you might ask? Well, dangerous to those who don't know and don't care about the difference between whom and who, for starters. That may sound trivial, but hear me out. You see, I'm after the child abusers who've insisted that grammar, vocabulary, spelling and punctuation are of no importance, as a result of which we are now confronted with Generation Airhead that cannot punctuate, spell, construct a sentence or think. And that is not trivial. The teachers' unions, whose own members don't know what an apostrophe is, the Ministry of Education bureaucrats and teachers' colleges that spawned them and raised them. To these child molesters of the mind, Perigo intends to be a danger. Similarly to the media mediocrity mafia, the television news executives who've unleashed bimbo Generation Airhead reporters onto the airwaves. Reporters who cannot speak. Reporters who sound like Air New Zealand flight attendants, who used to sound as glamorous as they used to look, but now say things like, "We'll arrive on Wellington at 6 o'clock," emphasising all the wrong words and mangling every last one of them. That's what you now hear on television. Adenoidal airheads who've rendered the channel's news bulletins unwatchable. Mark Jennings and Anthony Flannery, you should apologise for your crimes against excellence, against the language and against humanity, and resign now. You are disgusting blights on our cultural landscape. To such militant mediocrity mongers as you and the Prime Minister, who goes out of his way to sound like an airhead, Perigo intends to be dangerous as hell. Excellence is the fruit of thought, of reason. Reason was the glory of the excellent Greeks you see behind me. The men who first applied their minds to life's big questions, instead of accepting false beliefs ostensibly handed down by non-existent gods. Their greatest exemplar was this fellow, Aristotle, who said the starting point in our quest for knowledge and wisdom must be the actual world around us, not some supposed world somewhere else. That's why he's pointing down at what's actually here, while his erstwhile mentor, Plato, points up to something that isn't. Reason was the glory of the excellent Renaissance, which produced the excellent Raphael, who produced this excellent painting. Much better than postmodern smears and blotches, don't you think? The Renaissance, of course, also spawned the likes of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. As you can tell simply from contemplating their works, the Renaissance was a rebirth of the human mind and spirit after a millennium of crippling Christianity, in its heyday a stifling, savage superstition, much as Islam is now. Christian monks tortured this woman for heresy, eventually killing her by scraping off all her flesh with oyster shells. I call any form of superstition like that goblinism, because of its belief in a great goblin in the sky, traditionally known as God. Now, I defend to the death anyone's right to believe in goblinism, but it is, ladies and gentlemen, poppycock and piffle. It is anti-reason, and reason, I repeat, was the glory not just of ancient Greece and the Renaissance, it is still the glory of all mankind. To the enemies of reason, Perigo seeks to be a danger. Reason's tool, you see, is persuasion, not force. Reason is the father of freedom. Freedom's greatest enemy in these postmodern times is political correctness. Political correctness presumes to dictate what we may eat, drink, think, smoke and wear. Political correctness would forbid me to say anything I've just said on the grounds that somebody might be offended by it. Political correctness says all beliefs are equally valid, and it's inappropriate to pass judgment on any of them. Never mind the offensiveness of the atrocities committed in the name of Islamo-Goblinism. Just don't offend Islamo-Goblinites. Political correctness is the enemy of free speech, and its headquarters, ironically, is academia, which is supposed to be free speech's bastion. In fact, a phalanx of fascist philosophy professors and their colleagues in sociology, women's studies, literary criticism, and the like, all paid for by you, are doing their damnedest to shut free speech down, with politicians and bureaucrats acting as their brown shirts. Let's shut them down, not by force, that's their weapon, but the relentless resonance of ridicule redolent with reason. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, was my first peritorial. That's Perigo's agenda: reason, freedom, and excellence. To be exemplified each week at the programme's conclusion in a glorious snippet of music from the Romantic era, the time when music reached its pinnacle of excellence. I'll be back with my first excellent guest after this. Well, now, my very first guest on Perigo is a noble and notable exception to what I was saying earlier about academia. Yes, he's an academic, but no, he's not a knee-jerk lefty. He's not postmodern. At least I hope he's not. He's not knee-jerk anti-American. What he is an excellent commentator on international events, such as those in the Middle East and the nuclear situation in Japan. Ron Smith, my very great pleasure to have you as my first guest.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Lindsay.
So much we could talk about, apart from the nuclear situation and the Middle East. Your CV on the University of Waikato website says that you have a BSc in chemistry.
That's true.
That's from the University of Southampton. You got your MA and Doctor of Philosophy in Philosophy from the University of Waikato. Your major areas of teaching are international relations and security policy. So obviously the nuclear situation in the Middle East, we do want to get to those, but I'm curious, a Doctor of Philosophy in Philosophy, how did you get that? What did you specialise in?
Well, I specialised ultimately in applied ethics, and I did a doctoral thesis on the just war theory and trying to apply it to guerrilla war and terrorism, which at that time was progressively causing concern in its various manifestations. How I got there is a story which would take us longer than the 15 minutes I know you've got available. So suffice it to say, it was, perhaps in the best tradition of academic things, entirely driven by interest, progressively, and I think logical steps took me to finish the doctorate, and then further logical things happened to me in terms of career opportunities, which led me to where I presently am, as you've been describing. You
must feel at home among these fellows here.
Yes, it was a great pleasure to see them. Intimidating, though, it
old friends. Oh, Parmenides, it's you again. Haven't seen you in ages.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things studying what these fellows wrote, and they started us on our philosophical journey, but you know, there's nothing new under the sun. The same debates they had, we're still having now. I'd just like to leap from metaphysics and epistemology, which is what we've been touching on, to politics, because I know that you, like me, started out as something of a lefty. I was as far left as you could get. I don't think you were ever that far left, but you were telling me before we started recording that in Britain you were a member of the Labour Party and ran for Parliament for the Labour Party.
That is indeed correct, and I should position myself distinct from you, I think, Lindsay, by saying that I was a moderate lefty, so I haven't quite made the transition you have.
But what made you make the transition from left to right?
Oh, gosh, I mean, some people talk about it merely as a process of growing up, coming up against the realities of these things. That might be a sort of patronizing way of putting it for those who haven't yet grown up. But yeah, it seems to me a natural transition. You look from the kind of simplified theories about how the world could be transformed to utopia, and you realize that isn't going to happen. You're going to make practical arrangements which you think might improve the situation. And I think, and I don't know how consistent this is with what you were saying, but I think ideologies of any kind are to be avoided.
Even a libertarian ideology that says we should live in freedom.
Maybe, but look, I need to prepare myself for that, and you might have to invite me again.
Well, it depends on
how
what you say in the next few
today.
minutes.
Yeah, okay.
How is it for you now, having your moderate right views, your sceptical right views, in a cesspool of leftyism, which is academia? How do you survive?
Well, it's a bit difficult. I mean, I guess without going too far down this track, and in other words, not going so far down the track that I can't return to Hamilton tomorrow.
Well, I make no guarantees.
But it's true. I mean, look, and you're not by any means the first person to have said to me, gosh, how do you get away with saying that or thinking that in your circumstances? And well, I guess I might be treated with kind of vaguely tolerant, not always tolerant, but vaguely tolerant kind of acceptance.
You're probably just seen as eccentric.
Possibly that too.
Quaint. The family pet who's a bit wayward.
Well, I'm not even sure that the affection that the family pet might get would be quite appropriate.
Well,
but
I would just like to make the point, and I did make it in my editorial. It's the editorial with which Perigo begins his program. That it is a form of tyranny, the political correctness, that is deeply entrenched in Waikato University in particular. So I think you've done extraordinarily well to be as clearly intact as you are. Now, I imagine the nuclear situation is one on which you do find yourself at variance with many of your colleagues, but I don't think you'd have the knee-jerk, we should never go near nuclear again response that so many are having.
No, and as I've said in other places in other interviews, I've actually been to the nuclear plant 14 years ago, Fukushima, the one that's the main focus of present concern. And so it was, in a certain sense, a great shock to imagine what the situation would have been with the wall of water that struck that plant, and the difficulties the plant operators would have been having, and to a considerable degree are still having with the consequences. But it hasn't, I mean, in a way, my conviction from the outset has been that when we come to the wash-up here, we'll find that, yes, we've had a serious accident. We've probably learnt some things about nuclear technology and the sorts of precautions that one might reasonably take. But ultimately it remains, and particularly for Japan it remains, an important source of power. And I think, well, we have to avoid that knee-jerk reaction you were talking about.
Well, even President Obama has avoided it and has insisted that nuclear will remain an integral part of America's energy strategy, and they get 20% of their power.
They do indeed. I don't know how sincere he is with that policy. I mean, I'm not sure if you look at the details of what the Obama administration's actually doing, that they're all that supportive.
Well, he won't let any drilling go ahead, so he's got to get his energy
we're
from
talking
somewhere.
on the oil. Yes, that's indeed. But in fact, various agencies in the American government are blocking the development, blocking plans, putting unreasonable conditions, in my view, on some of those developments. That is the problem. If the Obama administration, it seems to me, he's got a whole lot of people with well-entrenched ideologies, which I think are anti-nuclear in many of them, and they're anti a lot of other things.
Yes.
And whatever he says in the many wonderful speeches he makes, the fact is his government is not really encouraging nuclear power all that strongly, in my view.
What then do we take out of Japan? Now, that plant was built for a Force 7, I believe. It could withstand a Force 7. This was a Force 9. So I would take it, we should say, build for a Force 9 or beyond, and don't put them along the coast. Would that be right?
Well, Not necessarily. I mean, in actual fact, Lindsay, I was looking at something this very morning, which was about the design basis for those plants as far as earthquakes were concerned. And I think it was slightly higher than the figure you gave. I think it was something like 7.8. But even that is more than 10 times less than what actually happened in the way of the earthquake. But my understanding is that the earthquake damage on the plant wasn't the significant matter. The big matter was the tsunami. As everybody knows.
Therefore, don't put them along the coast.
Well, yes and no, you see. If you look at what they've been doing over the last few days, they've been using the copious supplies of the water yes. of seawater from right nearby to try and make do. And if they'd not been on the coast, it may be we should be talking about difficulties in getting the vast amounts of water that they needed. I'm speculating there. But I'm presuming that there might be things to be learned. But I'm also presuming two things. One is, when the final reports are written, the health effects of that will be minimal compared with the enormous human disaster that the tsunami caused.
So nuclear is still good, and we should think of the future in terms of nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you could look at the accidents that have occurred in civilian nuclear power generation, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and now Fukushima. No doubt they'll be the three talked about in the future. At the moment, it looks as if Chernobyl will be the worst, and Fukushima will be number 2 on the list, and 3 Mile Island, because of the next to no release of nuclear material into the atmosphere, will be 3rd on the list. But that said, I mean, we need to remind ourselves what the consequences of Chernobyl were. About 60 people were killed by that. A speculative number may have adverse health effects over the 60 years that they might well live from the original accident. A sense of proportion. Indeed, one could say, and perhaps I'm going to be a bit more outrageous now by saying, we might say of Chernobyl and this one, well, we can be confident about nuclear power, but when the worst happens, it's not all that bad.
Let's come back then to our friend President Obama with regard to the events in the Middle East. In my lifetime, I haven't seen such a weak American president, such an abnegation of leadership, such a reminder of what Neville Chamberlain was like, only I think worse.
It's interesting you should say that, because about 12 months ago, perhaps a little more, I wrote a blog which was entitled, "Is Barack Obama the Chamberlain of the 21st century?" And it's before many of the things that are going to be in your mind, and I agree with you 100%. I think the performance of Barack Obama as president has been depressing, and progressively so, and particularly over the Libyan thing, where here was an opportunity, maybe with whatever uncertainties one might have had about what the outcome might have been, to support a popular movement against an egregious and long-running dictatorship. And the possibility of something better, something that the people of Libya wanted, and that could have been supported by the Americans with minimal cost to them. And I think it's a shame that they didn't do it.
Dragged, kicking and screaming, to the no-fly zone, in part, of all people, by the French, who are not renowned for their forthrightness normally. But he said some weeks ago that Gaddafi had lost his credibility and lost his authority. When did Gaddafi ever have credibility and authority? Now, this is the person of whom Ronald Reagan said he's the mad dog of the Middle East. Both rhetorically and in practical terms, Obama has been so weak, and I fear for what that means for the whole region.
And I think there's a lesson to be learned to compare him with George W. Bush. You see, Bush attacks Iraq. Hopefully we're not going to discuss that as well in our time allocated, but One of the consequences of that seems to have been it put the wind up Gaddafi. And it caused him to think twice about his then nuclear weapons program. So he handed everything over, made a clean breast of everything, and we, apart from the Libyan nuclear threat as it might have been, being disposed of, we also got enormous insights into A.Q. Khan's activities selling nuclear technology to all who wanted it. Now that was because he was intimidated. Obama's policy has been exactly the opposite, not only with Gaddafi but with everybody else. This timid, apologetic performance around the world has meant that everybody knows nothing is to be threatened. And even from the beginning to the end of the Libyan thing, you see a marked change in the behavior of Gaddafi.
But of overall concern is, all right, there is this groundswell of rebellion across the Middle East, and people are getting uppity, the natives are getting restless with their despotic regimes. But the question is, what is going to take their place? Because it is the will of some people, many people who live there, that you go out of the frying pan into a theocratic fire with Iranian-type regimes in some of the other countries. There are people in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, who would like that. So we can't be unambiguously enthusiastic about the groundswell, can we?
No, we can't be. But I think in certain cases it might have been, dare I say, a risk worth taking. In the long run, we might think the best thing for the Middle East is if they could somehow, as peacefully as possible, transition to a more democratic regime. That would be in our security interests in the long term, apart from being in the interests of millions, well, hundreds of millions of people who are presently living in these terrible regimes. So, in a sense, there's a case, it seems to me, for thinking that to be worthwhile and worthwhile supporting. But the point you make, of course, is well made. And that is a considerable risk that in some of these cases we find an Islamic theocratic regime which is worse for the people and worse for us as well. Incidentally, I'm not at all sure that even if Obama had been more supportive of the Iranian Green Revolution, the outcome would have been much different.
Well, Ron Smith, you keep alluding to other things that we might talk about, and indeed I would like very much to, but alas, our time for today is up. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Ron Smith. Well, that's almost the program for this week. My thanks again to Ron Smith, Waikato University, for being my guest. Just before we go, the Renaissance, of which we were speaking earlier, brought liberating innovations in music, leading directly to new heights of excellence in the Baroque and classical genres. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, however, even these had been surpassed in the idiom we now call Romanticism. New instruments, bigger orchestras, the cult of the conductor and soloist, more complex harmonies and rhythms, the injection of emotion, both subtle and extreme, the projection of man the valuer, man the hero, unabashed individualism. All of these came together to bring mankind music of unequaled grandeur, music to induce the most intense and lofty value swoon, as I like to call it. Each week, as part of its commitment to excellence, Perigo will conclude with a gem from the Romantic era. Tonight, Russian pianist Mikhail Pletnev with the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Claudio Abbado, performs the 18th variation from Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini. In the name of reason, freedom, and excellence, I'm Lindsay Perigo.